In this video, we are going to be coding the content area of our page. This area contains the world's most famous logo, that is the Google logo. Next to it, the country name, below it, the Google search bar, and below the search bar, there are two submit buttons. So first of all, we shall create a div with the ID of content. This will contain all these elements that we have just seen. Closing div tag. And inside the CSS file, let's give our content a height and also a light background color so that we can visually see that it's taking more or less the same height that it should. I'm giving my content area a height of 480 pixels and there's no special reason behind it. I'm also applying it a background color so that it's easy to locate inside the browser. Great. I've given this height because it will exactly replicate the original Google page when seen in the Firefox browser. If the same page is seen in Chrome, it may not span the complete height of the Chrome browser. And since we are doing our first ever web page, therefore we don't need to worry about the cross-browser issues because that is a bit advanced topic. So I would advise you to right now just follow me and set the height for your content to be 480 pixels as well. And view your page in the Firefox browser. If this is not possible, don't worry at all. Just set the height for 80 pixels and move on. Now if we save and load our page in the browser, we see that our content has a certain background color, but it is touching the top of our browser. It should start right next to our header, but since the header contains floats, so it has collapsed, we just need to clear it. So we don't need to think clear left or right, just right clear both and we'll be okay. Here we are. Now the first thing we need to add inside our content is of course the gigantic and the world's most famous Google logo. So we'll add its markup inside our HTML file, starting with the img tag, image source. Let's browse our image. We should find it inside the images folder that we have already created. That's great. Now if we save and load into the browser, we see that as expected, the image begins at the top left corner of its container. Let's just bring the image at the center of its container. There are two things that need to be done to achieve this result. First, we need to set the display property of our image to block, since by default it's an inline level element. And let's then set the margin value to 0 and auto. This is used for centering the element inside its container. Now if reloaded, we see that image is exactly at the center. Right. Now there are two methods of bringing the image down to its exact location. One is giving the position property of relative to the image and then creating the distance from the top edge. Second method is, as you must have guessed, giving a margin top to the image. I think it's a good idea to position the image rather than creating a huge margin. So let's give our image a position property of relative and then create a distance of 130 pixels from top. Here we go. It's important to understand why we have given our image the position of relative and not absolute. The reason is the position of relative would bring the image down from its current position, while a position of absolute would have taken the image back to the top left corner, and from there on we would have brought the image to where it is right now, and this way the code that we wrote to center the image a moment ago would have become meaningless. Alright. Now that our image has reached its final destination, time for us to create the text box. For this we'll create the form element and then inside we'll create an input element with the type of text. Then give it an ID of text box. Now inside our CSS file, let's give it a margin of 0 and auto. But first set the display property to block because it's an inline level element, so that our text box is also right at the center of the page. Save and load into the browser, and here is the initial shape of our text box. Now let's give it a margin top of 150 pixels. Give it a width of 523 pixels and a height of 19 pixels. Again, these things have already been calculated for you. You can also calculate themselves by just hitting F12 after opening the Google homepage. Alright, now if we reload, we see that here we have our nice and clean search bar. Next are the submit buttons. And to create the submit buttons, let's first create a div that will contain these two buttons. And let's give an ID to this div of buttons as well. And then also give a background color to our div so that it's easy for us to see where our div is located inside the browser, although we know that we want it to be centered. We have given a background color of black to our div. Doesn't matter which color we give since we are ultimately going to remove it. And to center our div, let's give it a margin of 0 and auto, a width of 250 pixels so that it's wide enough to contain both the buttons side by side. We don't need to set the display property to block because the div is by default a block level element. Now let's first write the HTML markup of our first button, input type submit, and give it an ID of give it a value of Google search. Let's create the second button, input type submit, and let's give it a value of I am feeling lucky. Are you? And here we are. You see the button. We see that the buttons are now at our desired place. Now let's remove the background from the div. And create a margin top of 10 pixels. This is the result of creating a margin of 10 pixels. And let's remove the background, save and reload, and here we are. Great, we are doing great. Now what is left is just the footer, and then time to rock and roll. So let's create it, but yeah, you have guessed, in the next video. Thanks for watching.